This video is made for entertainment purposes only. I found something in the dark that I was never supposed to see. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about who's really watching us. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a spelunker, a cave explorer, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life crawling through some of the most remote underground systems in the Pacific Northwest. I've seen crystal caverns that nobody's photographed, underground rivers that don't appear on any map, and limestone formations that took millions of years to create. I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. What I discovered 3 months ago, deep beneath the Cascade Mountains in a cave system that officially doesn't exist, has kept me awake every night since. I'm telling this story now because I need someone else to know. Because if something happens to me, this needs to be on record. Because what I found down there suggests we've never been alone. And more terrifyingly, it suggests they've been documenting everything we've done, every war, every atrocity, every step toward our own destruction. They've been keeping a record. Waiting. Watching from the shadows for us to finish what we've started. It was early September when I first entered what I now call the Witness Cave. I'd been tracking an unexplored branch off the main Cascade Cavern system for nearly 2 years, using ground-penetrating radar and old mining surveys to identify a network that didn't match any known geological formation. Most cavers work in teams, but I prefer going solo on preliminary surveys. It's dangerous, yes, but it gives me the freedom to move at my own pace, to follow my instincts without group consensus slowing me down. I had my satellite beacon, my backup oxygen, my climbing gear, and enough provisions for a 3-day underground expedition. The entrance I found was barely a crack in the rock face, hidden behind a collapsed mining structure from the 1940s. I had to remove 3 feet of debris just to squeeze through. The passage beyond was tight, what we call a squeeze, forcing me to exhale completely just to inch forward on my belly, my headlamp illuminating nothing but damp limestone inches from my face. For 40 minutes I crawled through that suffocating tube, my pack dragging behind me on a rope, my breathing echoing in my own ears. Twice I nearly turned back. Twice I told myself this was stupid, reckless, the kind of decision that gets solo cavers killed. But then the passage opened up. I tumbled forward into a chamber so vast my headlamp couldn't find the ceiling. The beam disappeared into darkness above me, and when I shone it across the space, it barely reached the far wall. The air here was different, fresher somehow, with a slight movement that suggested ventilation from somewhere deeper in the system. I stood there for a long moment, drinking water and letting my heartbeat slow down, marveling at the silence. Underground silence is different from surface quiet. It's complete. Total. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own blood moving through your veins. That's when I noticed the air wasn't quite still. There was a draft, subtle but present, coming from a passage on the far side of the chamber. And with it came something else. A smell. Not the usual cave smell of minerals and dampness, but something organic. Something that reminded me of wood smoke. Old wood smoke, like from a campfire that had burned out days ago. I followed it. The passage narrowed again, but not severely. I could walk upright, though I had to turn sideways occasionally to navigate past protruding rock formations. The smell grew stronger as I descended, and I noticed something that made me pause. The walls were smooth. Not naturally smooth, not worn by water over millennia, but deliberately smoothed. Someone, or something, had worked these walls. I ran my gloved hand over the stone and felt the unmistakable marks of tools. Primitive tools, maybe, but tools nonetheless. My mind raced through possibilities. Native American sites. I'd explored caves with ancient indigenous artwork before, but never this deep, never this inaccessible. The entrance I'd squeezed through had been completely blocked until I'd cleared it. Nobody had been through there in decades, maybe longer. So how had anyone reached this place? The tunnel curved downward in a gentle spiral, and I descended for what my GPS unit later told me was nearly 800 feet. The temperature dropped steadily, and my breath began to fog in the beam of my headlamp. The smell of old smoke grew stronger, joined now by something else. Something musky and animal, but not unpleasant. It reminded me of the smell of my grandfather's barn, that mixture of hay and livestock and earth. Then the tunnel opened into another chamber, and I saw the paintings. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. My headlamp beam swept across the wall and caught colors, reds and blacks and whites, and my brain tried to categorize it as mineral deposits, natural discoloration in the limestone. But then I took 3 steps closer, and my breath caught in my throat. They were paintings. Cave paintings. But not like any I'd ever seen or studied. The wall stretched at least 60 feet across and 20 feet high, and every inch of it was covered in images. Figures and symbols and scenes rendered in what looked like natural pigments, ochre and charcoal and white clay, applied with stunning precision and detail. I stood there, frozen, my headlamp beam slowly panning across the mural, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Because I recognized what I was seeing. The paintings showed human history. Our history. But depicted from an outsider's perspective, like an anthropological record kept by observers studying a dangerous species. On the far left, rendered in faded reds and browns, were scenes I recognized from history books. Columbian-era ships, European settlers, conflicts with indigenous peoples. The style was primitive but clear, ships with sails, men in period clothing, rifles and conflicts rendered in stark, brutal honesty. Moving to the right, the timeline progressed. Civil War soldiers. Railroad construction. The Industrial Revolution shone through smokestacks and factories. World War I trenches, complete with gas masks and barbed wire. But it was the modern images that made my blood run cold. World War II. The mushroom clouds were unmistakable. 2 of them, rendered in white and yellow pigments that seemed to glow in my headlamp beam. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, documented in cave paint by someone who had somehow witnessed or learned of their devastation. The Cold War. Missile silos. Nuclear submarines. Vietnam. Desert storm. The Twin Towers falling on September 11th, depicted with horrifying accuracy. 2 rectangular structures with smoke and debris, tiny figures falling from the heights. And the timeline continued right up to the present. I could see images that couldn't be more than a few years old. Drone strikes. Smartphone-wielding crowds. Climate disasters, floods and fires rendered in apocalyptic detail. But interspersed among these human events were other images. Scenes that didn't fit any history book I knew. Large, bipedal figures, clearly not human, clearly ape-like, but with an upright posture and intelligent eyes, fleeing from human hunters. Being shot. Being captured. Being driven deeper into wilderness that shrank with each progressive panel. And in the most recent images, these same figures were shown in what looked like observation posts. Watching from cave mouths as human cities burned in the distance. Documenting mushroom clouds from mountain peaks. Recording our self-destruction from the safety of the deep places we could never reach. The final panel, on the far right, was the most disturbing. It showed those same bipedal figures emerging from caves and forests into an empty, overgrown world. Human cities crumbling and being reclaimed by nature. And in the center of this final scene, rendered larger than all the other figures, was what could only be described as a council of these beings, gathered around what looked like the very wall I was staring at. They were painting, recording, witnessing, waiting for us to be gone. I don't know how long I stood there. My sense of time had completely fractured. It might have been minutes. It might have been an hour. My legs were shaking, and I realized I needed to sit down before I fell down. I lowered myself to the cave floor and just stared at the wall, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The implications were staggering. Someone, something, had been watching human civilization evolve and destroy itself for hundreds of years, maybe longer. These paintings represented a continuous, unbroken record kept by observers who had remained hidden, documenting everything from the shadows. And the level of detail in the recent images meant something even more disturbing. This wasn't ancient history being recorded from oral tradition or distant observation. The 9/11 painting showed details that would only be known to someone who had been there, or who had access to detailed photographic records. The drone strikes, the smartphone crowds, these required contemporary knowledge, which meant whoever painted these had been among us. Recently, watching from positions close enough to see details, yet remaining completely undetected, I thought about the stories. The legends I'd always dismissed as folklore and fantasy. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the wild man of the woods. Native American accounts of the forest people who walked like men but weren't men, who watched from the trees and vanished like ghosts. What if they were all true? What if there was an intelligent species living parallel to ours, staying hidden, surviving in the deep places and watching us destroy ourselves? What if they'd been doing this for centuries, maintaining a record, waiting for the day when we'd finally finish what we'd started and leave the world empty again? The thought should have seemed insane. But sitting there in that underground gallery, staring at detailed depictions of events I'd seen on television news, rendered in cave paint by unseen hands, insanity seemed like the only rational response. That's when I noticed something that sent a new wave of cold terror through my body. I stood up and approached the wall slowly, my headlamp focused on the most recent section of the painting, the part showing drone strikes and forest fires. I reached out and gently touched the pigment. It was still slightly damp. Not wet, not fresh enough to smudge, but not completely dry either. I'd done enough rock art documentation to know what fully dried cave paint felt like. This was recent. Days recent, maybe a week or two at most, but certainly not ancient, not even months old. Someone had been here. Recently. Painting current events while I was planning my expedition. I spun around, my headlamp beams sweeping across the chamber, suddenly hyper-aware that I might not be alone. The chamber was empty, just the smooth walls and the tunnel entrances. Plural, I now noticed. There were at least 3 other passages leading out of this gallery, and I had no idea where any of them went. My heart was hammering again, but this time not from exertion. From pure primal fear. Because I'd done something incredibly stupid. I'd traveled 3 days into an unmapped cave system, squeezed through an entrance that I'd had to excavate myself, and descended 800 feet into a chamber that clearly served as a sacred or significant site for beings who had good reason to stay hidden from humans. If they came back while I was here, if they found me in their gallery, photographing their records, I had no idea what they would do. And nobody on the surface even knew exactly where I was. My training as a documenter kicked in, overriding the panic. If I was going to leave, and I needed to leave soon, I had to record what I was seeing. Nobody would believe me otherwise. Hell, I barely believed it myself. I pulled out my camera and started photographing everything. Wide shots of the entire wall. Close-ups of individual panels. Detail shots showing the progression from historical to contemporary events. I took over 200 photos in 15 minutes. My hand shaking so badly I had to brace the camera against the wall for stability. But photographs alone wouldn't be enough. I needed physical evidence. Something tangible that could be analyzed, dated, verified by others. I approached the section with the freshest paint, a panel showing what looked like the Australian bushfires from 2020, rendered in blacks and oranges with terrifying accuracy. Using a sterile sample container for my kit, I carefully scraped a tiny amount of the pigment from an edge where my collection wouldn't be noticeable. The paint came away easily, still slightly moist, and I sealed it immediately. Then I collected samples from older sections too, the World War II panels, the Civil War images, even the colonial-era paintings on the far left. If I could get these dated, it would prove the timeline, prove that this wasn't some elaborate modern hoax. As I worked, I kept one ear focused on the other tunnels, listening for any sound of movement. The chamber remained silent except for my own breathing and the slight drip of water somewhere in the darkness above. I was sealing the last sample container when I heard it. A sound. Distant but distinct. Like stone scraping against stone, coming from one of the other passages. I froze, my hand halfway to my pack, every muscle in my body locked in place. The sound came again. Definitely stone on stone, rhythmic and deliberate. Not random cave noises from settling rock. This was purposeful. Something moving. Something big enough to displace rock as it moved. Something coming closer. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab my pack and scramble back up the tunnel, to squeeze through that horrible suffocating passage and not stop until I saw daylight. But something else held me there. Something I can only describe as a journalist's instinct, or maybe just human curiosity pushed beyond reason. Because if something was coming, if the artists were returning, then I had a chance to see them. To confirm what the paintings suggested. To face the witnesses. I switched off my headlamp. The darkness was instant and absolute. The kind of darkness that doesn't exist on the surface, where there's always some ambient light from stars or moon or distant cities. This was the darkness of deep earth, so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eyes. I moved as quietly as I could toward the side of the chamber, pressing my back against the smooth wall near one of the other tunnel entrances. If something came through the main passage, the one I'd entered from, I'd be out of direct sight. Maybe. The stone scraping sounds grew louder. Now I could hear breathing. Deep, steady breathing. Not panting or labored, but the calm respiration of something large moving at a comfortable pace. Then I heard something else. Something that made my blood freeze and my rational mind nearly shatter. Humming. Whatever was approaching was humming. Not a melody I recognized, nothing human, but a low, rhythmic vocalization that was unmistakably intentional. Unmistakably intelligent. Light began to filter into the chamber. Not electric light, not the focused beam of a flashlight or headlamp, but the warm, flickering glow of fire. Torchlight. The humming grew louder, and then the source entered the gallery. I'm going to describe what I saw as clearly and accurately as I can, because I know how insane this sounds. I know what I'm asking you to believe. But I was there, pressed against that wall in absolute darkness, watching by torchlight, and this is what I witnessed. It was massive. At least 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. Its body was covered in dark reddish-brown hair, longer on the head and shoulders, shorter on the arms and torso. The face was a mixture of ape and human features, pronounced brow ridge, flat nose, but eyes that were disturbingly human in their expressiveness and intelligence. It walked fully upright with a grace that belied its size, carrying a torch made from what looked like bundled dried grasses soaked in some kind of oil or fat. The torch was held in a hand that, despite being massive and covered in hair, had an opposable thumb and fingers that manipulated the torch with clear dexterity. But what struck me most, what made me certain I wasn't looking at some unknown ape species but at something genuinely intelligent, was what it was carrying in its other hand. A bowl. Carved from wood and filled with what I assumed were pigments. Painting supplies. The creature, and I'm going to call it that because I don't know what else to call it, moved directly to the wall, to a section just past the Australian bushfires panel. It set the torch in a natural crack in the floor where it stood upright, then knelt before the wall with the bowl beside it. And it began to paint. I watched, barely breathing, as those large fingers selected pigments from the bowl with surprising delicacy. It dipped what looked like a primitive brush, maybe animal hair bound to a stick, into black pigment and began adding to the mural. I could see what it was painting. A new panel. Fresh images. Flooding. Massive flooding. Cities underwater. I recognized what it was depicting, the catastrophic floods that had hit Pakistan and parts of Europe just this past summer. Events from months ago, being recorded in real time by this hidden witness. The creature worked with focus and skill, adding details that could only come from direct observation or photographic reference. Buildings partially submerged. Crowds of displaced people. Rescue helicopters. The level of accuracy was staggering. I stood there in the darkness, watching history being documented by the very beings we dismissed as folklore, and I felt something break inside my understanding of the world. Everything I thought I knew about humanity's place on this planet, about who was really watching and recording and remembering, shattered and reformed into something stranger and more humbling. We weren't alone. We'd never been alone. And while we'd been congratulating ourselves on being Earth's dominant species, documenting our own triumphs and tragedies, someone else had been keeping a separate record. A more honest record. One that showed us as we really were, violent, destructive, innovative, and tragically bent on our own extinction. The creature painted for what must have been 20 minutes. I lost track of time, mesmerized by the process, by the careful addition of each detail. It would step back occasionally, tilting its head to assess the work with an artist's critical eye, then return to add more. When it finally seemed satisfied with the flooding panel, it moved slightly to the right and began a new image. This one showed fire. Not forest fire, but urban fire. Explosions. I realized it was documenting the recent conflict in the Middle East, the bombing campaigns, the destruction of cities I'd seen on the news just weeks ago. The creature's humming had stopped while it painted, replaced by a deep silence broken only by the sound of brush against stone. But now, as it worked on this new panel, it made a different sound. A sound of grief. It was almost a moan, low and mournful, resonating in that massive chest. The sound an intelligent being makes when confronted with tragedy they cannot prevent, suffering they can only witness and record. The creature was mourning us. Mourning what we were doing to ourselves. That's when I made my mistake. The realization hit me with such emotional force, the understanding that this being felt sorrow for humanity's self-destruction, that I gasped. Just a small intake of breath, barely audible. But in that perfect underground silence, it was enough. The creature froze mid-brushstroke. Its entire body went rigid, and the mournful sound cut off instantly. Then, slowly, it turned its head toward where I stood. Even in the dim torchlight, I could see its eyes. Dark and intelligent and filled with something I can only describe as ancient sadness. They locked onto my position with uncanny accuracy, seeing me in the darkness despite my stillness. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. Then it stood. Fully upright. All 8 or 9 feet of it. The torch behind it cast its shadow across the wall, a massive silhouette that engulfed several panels of its own artwork. I thought about running. But there was nowhere to go. The tunnel I'd come from was on the other side of the chamber, and this creature stood between me and that exit. The other passages were unknown territory, possibly dead ends. So I did the only thing I could think of. I raised my empty hands, palms forward, in the universal gesture of non-aggression. For a long moment, the creature just stared at me. I could see its chest rising and falling with deep breaths, could see the muscles in its arms and shoulders tensing. It was deciding what to do with me. Then it did something I didn't expect. It mimicked my gesture. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its own massive hands, palms forward, fingers spread. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Just acknowledging. Communicating. I see you. I am not a threat. I let out a shaky breath. I'm not going to hurt you, I said quietly, knowing the words meant nothing but hoping the tone might convey intention. I'm not going to tell anyone about this place. The creature tilted its head, the same gesture of assessment it had used while examining its painting. It was studying me now with that same critical, intelligent gaze. Then it did something that confirmed everything I'd already concluded about its intelligence. It pointed at my camera. The gesture was unmistakable. It had seen me photographing the walls. It knew what a camera was, knew what it meant. And it was asking me about it. My mouth went dry. The photos, I said, touching the camera hanging from my neck. You want me to delete them? The creature didn't respond with any clear gesture, but its eyes remained fixed on the camera. I thought about it. I thought about the evidence I'd collected, the samples in my pack, the 200 photographs documenting the impossible. I thought about what those photos would mean: proof of an intelligent species, vindication of centuries of eyewitness accounts, a complete revolution in our understanding of Earth's biodiversity. I thought about what revealing this place would mean for these beings. The media attention, the scientific expeditions, the tourists and believers and hunters, the government interest, the military interest. I thought about how we treated every other species we'd encountered, especially those we saw as competition or curiosity. I thought about the paintings on the wall, that continuous record of human violence and destruction, documented by observers who had survived by staying hidden, by remaining a myth we could safely dismiss. And I made a decision. I'll keep your secret, I said quietly. But I need something to take back. Some proof, but nothing that will lead anyone here. Nothing that identifies this location. I slowly reached for my camera, moving deliberately so as not to startle the creature. It watched intently as I scrolled through the photos, my hands shaking. I deleted them. All of them. Every wide shot that showed the full wall, every image that captured enough context to map the chamber or identify the cave system. I deleted until only a handful remained, tight close-ups of individual panels, details that could have come from anywhere, without context or location markers. Then I held the camera up, showing the creature the screen with its now limited photo count. This is all I'm keeping, I said. Just enough to prove these paintings exist, but not enough to find them. The creature studied the camera screen, and I could see intelligence processing, evaluating, deciding whether to trust me. Then it did something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It gestured toward the tunnel I'd entered from. It was giving me permission to leave. I bent slowly to pick up my pack, my eyes never leaving the creature. As I shouldered the bag, it made a low sound, not threatening, almost conversational. Then it moved to the wall, to a section I hadn't noticed before, hidden partially in shadow to the left of the colonial-era paintings. It touched the wall there, pressing its palm flat against the stone, and looked back at me. I approached cautiously, and in the torchlight I could now see what it was showing me. Handprints. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering this section of the wall in overlapping layers. But these weren't human handprints. They were too large, the fingers too long, the palms too broad. They were the handprints of its species. A record not just of what they'd witnessed, but of who had done the witnessing. Generation after generation of artists and observers, each leaving their mark, creating a continuity that stretched back further than the paintings themselves. The creature pressed its palm against the wall again, adding its own print to the collective record. Then it turned to me and gestured toward the wall. It was offering me a place in the record. I understood the significance. The honor. The trust. This was a gesture of recognition, one witness acknowledging another. One recorder of history offering another a place in the collective memory. With trembling hands, I pressed my palm against the wall beside its fresh print. The stone was cold and slightly damp, and when I pulled my hand away, I could see the faint impression I'd left, my small human handprint next to the massive mark of the creature. We stood there for a moment, side by side before that wall of hands, two intelligent species sharing a brief moment of understanding in the deep darkness of the earth. Then the creature made a different sound, sharper, more urgent. It was time for me to go. I made my way back to the tunnel, moving slowly, looking back several times. The creature remained by the wall, watching me leave. In the torchlight, surrounded by its own artwork documenting humanity's long march toward self-destruction, it looked like a guardian of memory. A keeper of truths we were too busy destroying each other to record honestly. The last thing I saw before entering the tunnel was the creature returning to its painting, kneeling before the wall to continue documenting our most recent catastrophes. The climb back was a nightmare. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My mind couldn't process what I'd just experienced. I scraped my shoulders raw, squeezing back through that horrible tight passage, and I didn't care. I just needed out. Needed air. Needed sky. When I finally emerged 3 days later, dehydrated, exhausted, and probably in the early stages of hypothermia, the sunlight felt like a physical assault. I sat outside that cave entrance for 2 hours, just breathing and staring at trees and trying to reconcile the world I'd left with the world I'd returned to. Nothing looked the same. Knowing what I now knew, that we were watched, that our history was being recorded by witnesses who had survived by hiding from us, that somewhere in the deep places they were documenting our march toward extinction, everything felt different. The first week after I emerged from that cave, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I convinced myself I needed time to process, to organize my thoughts, to analyze the evidence I'd collected before going public. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. I didn't know if I should tell anyone at all. I had the pigment samples. I had the handful of photos I'd kept, close-up shots of individual panels that showed enough detail to prove their existence but not enough to locate them. I had my detailed notes, written in the motel room where I'd collapsed after my emergence, my hands still shaking as I tried to capture every detail before my memory could distort it. And I had my handprint on that wall, pressed into stone beside the print of a being that science said couldn't exist, part of a record maintained by witnesses who had been watching us destroy ourselves for centuries. I sent the pigment samples to 3 different labs, each time using a different fake name and a different story about where they'd been collected. I told one lab they were from a mining site in Montana. I told another they were from a historical restoration project in Oregon. I told the third they were samples from a private art collection that needed authentication. The results came back over the next month, and each one made my hands shake when I opened the envelope. The freshest samples, the ones I'd scraped from the flooding and bombing panels, were dated to within the last 6 months. The pigments were natural: iron oxide, charcoal, clay, plant extracts. Exactly what you'd expect from someone creating art with materials found in nature. The older samples showed the same natural composition, but the dating became more interesting. The World War II panels tested to the 1940s. The Civil War images to the 1860s. The colonial-era paintings ranged from the late 1700s to early 1800s. The timeline was consistent. The record was real. Someone had been painting human history in that cave for at least 200 years, possibly much longer. And they'd been updating it continuously, right up to the present day. I sat in my apartment, staring at those lab reports, and felt the weight of what I knew pressing down on me like the stone ceiling of that deep chamber. That's when I started noticing I was being watched. It was subtle at first. A feeling of eyes on me when I hiked in the forests near my home. Shadows moving at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. Sounds in the woods at night, not threatening, just present. Observing. I found signs. A footprint near my campsite during a weekend expedition, pressed deep into mud beside a creek. It was 18 inches long, with a stride length that suggested something walking upright. I photographed it, measured it, then filled it in with dirt and stones so no one else would find it. Arrangements of stones appeared near trailheads I frequented, deliberate patterns that weren't there the day before. Messages, maybe, or just reminders. We know where you are. We're watching to see what you do with what you learned. I started leaving my own messages. Small piles of food at the edge of the forest behind my apartment. Offerings, maybe, or just acknowledgments. I see you too. I'm keeping my promise. The food was always gone by morning. My sleep deteriorated. I'd wake at 3 a.m. with the absolute certainty that something large was standing outside my window, watching my apartment with intelligent eyes, assessing whether I could be trusted. I never looked. I was afraid of what I might see, afraid of breaking whatever fragile understanding existed between us. And I started dreaming about the paintings. About new panels being added while I watched from the shadows. Images of melting ice caps and dying coral reefs. Images of nuclear facilities and biological weapons labs. Images of protests and riots and governments collapsing under the weight of their own corruption. In these dreams, the creatures painted faster and faster, racing to document everything before the final panel. The one showing them emerging into an empty world came true. 2 months after my discovery, I made contact with a colleague I trusted, Dr. Sarah Chen, an anthropologist who'd spent her career studying indigenous cultures and ancient art. I showed her the photos I'd kept. Just the close-ups, no context, no location information. We met at a coffee shop in Seattle, and I watched her face as she scrolled through the images on my laptop. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "Where did you find these?" "I can't tell you that. These are... The detail is extraordinary. The progression, the historical accuracy." She zoomed in on the 9/11 panel. "This isn't folklore art. This isn't symbolic or mythological representation. This is documentary. This is someone recording events they witnessed or studied." "I know. The pigments look natural. Are they?" I showed her the lab reports. All 3 of them. I watched her face go pale as she read through the dating results. "This isn't possible," she whispered. To maintain a continuous artistic record for over 200 years would require institutional continuity, generational knowledge transfer, a culture with strong oral traditions and artistic apprenticeship. It would require intelligence, I finished for her. Sophisticated social structures, long-term planning, abstract thinking, everything we associate with human cognition. She looked up at me, and I could see both excitement and terror in her eyes. "What created these, Marcus?" I told her. Everything. The cave, the gallery, the creature, the painting session I'd witnessed, the handprints on the wall. I told her about the grief in that mournful sound, about the intelligence in those eyes, about the deliberate documentation of our species' worst moments. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long time, staring at the photos on the screen. "You know what this means," she finally said. "If this is real, And these lab reports suggest it is. This changes everything. This is proof of a parallel intelligent species. This is the most significant anthropological discovery in human history. I know. So why are you showing me this in a coffee shop instead of calling every major research institution in the world? That was the question, wasn't it? The one I'd been wrestling with since the moment I deleted those photographs in the cave, standing before a creature who had trusted me enough to let me leave. Because I've seen what we do, I said quietly. I've seen what happens when we find something we want to study, to understand, to control. I've seen what happens to indigenous peoples when they're discovered by the dominant culture. I've seen what happens to species we decide are interesting or valuable. Sarah started to protest, but I cut her off. Those paintings, Sarah, they're not just a historical record. They're a warning. They're a document of what we are, created by observers who have survived by staying hidden. They've watched us commit genocide against indigenous populations. They've watched us develop weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth. They've watched us push hundreds of species to extinction while congratulating ourselves on being Earth's dominant intelligence. I pulled up one of the photos, the panel showing those massive figures being hunted, being driven into smaller and smaller wilderness areas. They know what we'd do if we found them. They've been documenting it for centuries. Every expansion of human civilization, every destroyed habitat, every species we've hunted to extinction or captured for zoos and laboratories. They know that being discovered by us is a death sentence. So what are you going to do? Sarah asked. Just keep it secret? Sit on the most important discovery in anthropology because you're afraid of what might happen. I'm not afraid of what might happen, I said. I know what will happen. Within a month of this going public, there would be expeditions trying to find that cave. Within 6 months, there would be government interest, military, intelligence, research. Within a year, there would be tourists and believers and hunters, all flooding into the forests looking for proof. I leaned forward, holding her gaze. And those beings who have survived for thousands of years by staying hidden, by remaining a myth we could safely dismiss, would be exposed. Studied, captured, probably, declared an endangered species and protected in reserves we control. Their culture would be disrupted, their privacy destroyed, their survival strategy shattered. And the alternative is lying? Sarah asked. Pretending you never saw this? Denying the world knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of intelligence and evolution. The alternative, I said carefully, is respecting their choice. They've stayed hidden because that's how they survive. They could reveal themselves at any time. They live close enough to human civilization to document our events in real time. But they don't. They choose to remain hidden. And after seeing those paintings, after understanding what they've witnessed us do, I respect that choice. Sarah was quiet for a long time, studying the photos, reading through the lab reports again. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts frustration and understanding. You're probably right, she admitted, about what would happen if this went public. We have a terrible track record with everything. Every species, every culture, every ecosystem we've encountered. We study them to death, literally. And these beings have been documenting that track record, I said. They've been keeping a more honest history than we keep ourselves. Look at these panels. There's no glorification, no justification, no propaganda. Just events, recorded with the cold accuracy of witnesses who have no stake in making us look good. I pulled up the final panel, the one showing the creatures emerging into an empty world after humanity's self-destruction. This is what they expect, I said. This is what their whole record points toward. They're not just documenting our history, they're waiting for our ending. They've watched us develop nuclear weapons, engineer biological threats, destabilize the climate, and create artificial intelligences we can't control. And they're painting our obituary while we're still alive to read it. That's terrifying, Sarah whispered. It's honest, I corrected. We're terrified because they're holding up a mirror and showing us what we really are. Not the heroes of our own story, not the pinnacle of evolution, not the wise stewards of the planet. Just another species that got too smart for its own good and too violent to survive its own intelligence. So what's the point? Sarah asked. If they think we're doomed, if they're just waiting for us to wipe ourselves out, what's the point of the record? Why maintain it for centuries? That was the question that had been haunting me since I left the cave. Why document our history so meticulously if they believed we were heading for extinction? Why maintain such detailed records of a species they expected to fail? I think, I said slowly, working through the idea as I spoke, they're keeping the record for themselves. For their own future. So that when we're gone, if we're gone, they have a complete history of what happened. A cautionary tale for their own species. A reminder of what happens when intelligence is combined with violence and short-term thinking. Or, Sarah said quietly, maybe they're keeping it because they hope we'll prove them wrong. Maybe the record is also a challenge. A way of saying, look at what you've done, look at where you're heading, now choose differently. That conversation was 3 weeks ago. I've been thinking about Sarah's words every day since. About choice. About whether the record is just a document of our inevitable failure or a challenge to do better. I've decided to tell this story. Not to reveal the cave's location. That secret dies with me. Not to prove the existence of these beings. Let them remain a myth for those who need them to be mythical. But to share what the paintings showed me, what they revealed about ourselves and our history. Because Sarah was right about one thing. It is a challenge. Those beings have watched us for centuries, documenting our worst moments and our most destructive decisions. They've seen us commit atrocities and then forget them, repeat mistakes and then deny them, create problems and then blame others for them. They've kept a more honest record of our species than we've ever kept ourselves. And they're still watching. Still painting. Still adding new panels to a mural that stretches back generations. Which means they haven't given up on us yet. If they truly believed we were beyond hope, beyond redemption, they could simply stop painting. Let our history end unrecorded, our final chapters left blank. But they're still there, in the deep places, torches lit and brushes ready, documenting everything we do. Bearing witness. Keeping the record complete. They're giving us the chance to prove that final panel wrong. To choose differently. To become something other than a cautionary tale painted on stone walls for another species to learn from. I still hike in the Cascade Mountains. I still explore caves, though I've never tried to find that particular chamber again. I keep my promise. But I leave messages at the forest edge. Small cairns of stone arranged in patterns. Offerings of food wrapped in leaves. Acknowledgements that I know they're there, watching, recording. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that creature kneeling before the wall with its bowl of pigments and its primitive brush, adding fresh panels to a record that stretches back centuries. I think about the grief in its mournful sound as it painted images of bombing campaigns and climate disasters. I think about my handprint on that wall, pressed into stone beside the prints of witnesses who have been documenting our species since before we even thought to document ourselves. And I think about what new panels they're adding now. What events from the past 3 months are being rendered in ochre and charcoal, added to a mural that grows longer every year. Climate records shattered. Species pushed closer to extinction. Political violence escalating. Weapons becoming more sophisticated. Artificial intelligences approaching capabilities their creators don't understand. The record continues. The witnesses remain hidden. The paintings grow more detailed and more disturbing. And somewhere in the deep places beneath the mountains, in chambers we were never meant to find, they're preparing the final panels. The ones that show either our extinction or our transformation. Our ending or our evolution. The choice is still ours. The witnesses are still watching. The brushes are still moving across stone. What history are we giving them to paint? I'm sharing this story now because I've started seeing signs that others are looking for the cave. There have been reports on cryptozoology forums about increased Bigfoot activity in the Cascades. Hikers claiming to find unusual arrangements of stones. Cave explorers discussing unexplored systems in the area where I made my discovery. Someone is going to find it eventually. If not the specific chamber I found, then another one, because I don't think there's just one gallery. A record-keeping operation this extensive, maintained for centuries, probably exists in multiple locations. Redundancy for preservation. Multiple witnesses maintaining multiple records. When someone does find it, when the inevitable photographs go viral and the expeditions begin and the scientific community descends on those hidden chambers, I want this account to exist first. I want it on record that we were warned, that we were shown, in stark and undeniable detail, what path we were on, that witnesses who survived by staying hidden trusted us enough to let us see their truth. And I want it known that we had a choice, that the final panel, the one showing either our end or our survival, wasn't predetermined. The witnesses are still painting because the story isn't finished. The outcome isn't certain. We can still prove them wrong. We can still create a different ending. But only if we're willing to see what they've been showing us all along. Only if we're brave enough to look at that honest record of our history and choose to do better. Choose to be better. The watchers are still in the deep places. The record continues. The truth is painted on walls we weren't meant to see. And the question they're asking with every new panel, with every fresh pigment applied to ancient stone, is the same question I'm asking now. What happens next? That's the story we're still writing. That's the panel they're still painting. And unlike all the historical scenes behind it, this one isn't finished yet. The brushes are ready. The witnesses are watching. The final image awaits. What will it show?